So the title of the lecture today is Two Phases of Primary Production. I'd like to ask anyone why they think that there are two phases of primary production. So before I actually answer that question, I'd like to lay the basis of the primary producers. So the process that they engage in is first and foremost called photosynthesis. I'm sure you're quite familiar about this already from grade school all the way to high school. So I will just give you a glimpse of this, or an overview of this. Basically, photosynthesis is the process of changing your light energy from the sun to chemical energy, and that energy is stored in the form of sugar. And so with that light energy, you take carbon dioxide and water and form it into glucose and oxygen. And that's the job of the primary producers, or what you can call the autotrophs. So we all like fish. We're the top predators. We eat fish, we eat small fish, big fish. And do you ever wonder though what those fish eat? So those are the primary producers, and I'd like to give you more of a picture of what those primary producers look like by watching this video. I hope you enjoy.
How did I get here? Well, it's a stranger story than you might think. I came from a world of drifters, a place few humans have ever seen. The world of plankton. I came from a batch of 1 million eggs, and only a few of us survived. When I became a larva, I moved among other drifters. My fellow plankton came in all sizes, from tiny algae and bacteria to animals longer than a blue whale. I shared my nursery with other embryos and juveniles, from clams and crabs to sea urchins and anemones. We drifting animals are called zooplankton. The most common animals here are copepods and krill. You could search the world over, but you'd never find a place more diverse than my childhood home. A teaspoon of seawater can contain more than 1 million living creatures. It can be a pretty tough existence, though. Trillions are born here, but only a few make it to adulthood. He may be no larger than a pinhead, but this crab larva is an arrowworm's worst nightmare. Epic battles between carnivores like these are just one way to get food. But the real powers of this place come from phytoplankton. Single-celled life that transforms sunlight and carbon dioxide into edible gold. Phytoplankton are the base for the largest food web in the world. During the night, many animals like me would rise up from the depths to feed on this sun-powered feast. I was part of the largest daily migration of life on Earth. During the day, I'd return to the darkness where I'd join my bizarre companions. Cannibals, like this sea butterfly mollusk that eats its next of kin. And comb jellies that beat cilia like rainbowed eyelashes. Some of these snare their prey with sticky tentacles, while others just take a bite out of their cousins. And siphonophores that catch prey with toxic fishing lures. But my favorite would have to be the crustacean Phronema. Its monstrous looks inspired the movie Aliens. It can catch tiny bits in its bristles, but prefers larger prey like salps. With 2 sets of eyes, this female prowls the deeper water. Prey in hand, she performs one of the strangest behaviors in the entire animal kingdom. With body parts from her victims, she delicately assembles a barrel-like home, feeding her young until they can drift off and survive on their own. Best of all, they make the perfect snack for a small fish like me. Here among the plankton, the food web is so tangled and complex, even scientists don't know who eats whom. But I do. At least now you know a bit of my story. There's so much more to me than just a tasty meal.
So from the video, you saw the wonderful base of the food chain, and in a very visual way, see how many different forms there are and how they eventually wind up in the stomachs of various marine organisms and eventually into probably your plate. So we'll go into more specifics about those types of photosynthetic marine organisms. The 4 main ones are your microscopic algae or microalgae, also called the phytoplankton. And then you also have the photosynthetic bacteria, and you have your macroalgae, or the larger macroalgae, also called the seaweed. And then you have your Anthophyta, or the seed-bearing plants. So in the next few slides, I'll be going through each of these in just a little more detail. So in terms of the phytoplankton, the main ones that you typically find in waters are called diatoms and dinoflagellates. And these pictures show you a variety of these different types of phytoplankton. So on the right side, you have more of your diatoms, which can form chains. You have different forms from rods to centric forms, and they're primarily composed of silica. Compared to your dinoflagellates, all these images more on the left hand side, then their theca, or their external structure, is made up more of cellulose, and they come also in a variety of forms and a variety of ways of living. Then you have your photosynthetic bacteria. Obviously, since they're bacteria, they're extremely small. However, they actually might be responsible for half of the total photosynthetic biomass in the oceans. But they're not as well studied as the other components of the ocean, although that's slowly being changed now because of the technological advances that we have in terms of identifying what bacteria there are. In those pictures you see that these bacteria can also form colonies, whether they're spherical colonies or filaments. And then you have your macroscopic algae or macroalgae, or more familiarly your seaweeds. And there's a variety of different types. Your brown algae, your red algae, which are actually one of the most abundant and most widespread macroalgae. And the brown algae is actually can grow really, really big. You'll find them in, for example, the large macroalgae, large brown macroalgae in the rich, nutrient-rich environment in the, for example, off of the coast of California, and they form what's called the kelp ecosystem. The red algae, on the other hand, we have a lot of those in our coral reefs. They actually help to cement coral reefs. Green algae, there are many types of green algae, and for example, one that you might be more familiar with is called lato. I'm sure that some of you have already eaten this, and usually we like it with some vinegar and tomato and onions as a seaweed salad. Just note that group colors don't actually reflect their real colors. So brown algae are not all brown or red, all red and green. Same for the green algae. So it's just a kind of a holdover from the old studies on the algae, where the initial samples seem to correlate with their particular colors. And then you have the seed-bearing plants, or the Anthophyta. So these are only found in shallow coastal waters. The prime example are seagrasses in mangrove forests. But we'll go through these in more detail when we tackle coastal ecosystems later on in the class. So here's an amazing picture of the primary productivity in the world's oceans. So this is taken through satellite imagery, and you can see the different colors on land, the different colors in the ocean. And basically, if you look at the ocean color, the redder it is, that means the more chlorophyll A that can be found in that area in terms of milligrams per cubic meter. So that means, since chlorophyll A is an indicator of your photosynthesis capacity, then that's an indicator of your primary production in this in each particular site in the ocean. And you see here that some of the most productive areas can be found on the eastern side of the ocean basins, as well as you can see those yellows and greens in the middle of the ocean basins. And that's because of particular factors that influence where primary productivity is high. So what those factors are, the most important factors are light, nutrients, temperature, grazing, or the ones that feed on them, and the motion of the water, or hydrodynamics. In terms of light, basically, since photosynthesis is a process that needs light, then it's a very critical component of where primary productivity can be high or not high. Some components of light that are important are that, one, the light is absorbed as you go deeper into the water, and so at the surface of the light there's high solar energy that reaches the sea surface, However, at around 1 meter, depending on the turbidity of the water, then about 45% only of the light from the surface reaches 1 meter, until you get to 100 meters where there's only 1% remaining of the light that was found in the ocean surface. But apart from the actual quantity of the light, the quality of the light changes as well, because the red wavelengths actually get absorbed faster as you go through the water column. And so by the time you get to 100 meters, it's more of the blues that are retained, while the reds have all been absorbed further up the ocean surface. And this is why the ocean is blue. The second key factor that influences the primary productivity are nutrients. Basically, it's like agriculture. In order for the plants to grow, they need their fertilizers. And in the ocean, it's in the same form pretty much. You have your nitrogen and your phosphorus, and some special ones for other types of phytoplankton, for example, silicate for diatoms and silicoflagellates. Those are the major nutrients that primary producers need. Some of the minor ones are also key, such as iron and zinc. And here, you see that there are different distributions of your nutrients through the water column. At the surface, they're pretty much low concentration, but as you go down deeper, all the way up to, for example, 1,000 meters, nutrients are become really high for both nitrate, phosphate, and your silicate. So there are also different concentrations or different distributions looking at different ocean types, Atlantic, Pacific, or Indian. There are slight differences. However, the main pattern wherein there are low nutrients up the water column and increased nutrient concentrations in the deeper parts of the water column remain through the different oceans. And so this is key to where you find your primary producers, because they have to figure out how to get enough light, which is found more at the surface, but then they also need the nutrients, which is found more at the bottom. So this is a dilemma for your primary producers in the water column, and different factors help to combine both light and nutrients and increase primary productivity in certain areas, which I'll give an example of later. And then, of course, temperature is an important factor that influences primary production, because it influences the metabolism of your primary producers. And there are large-scale latitudinal differences. Primarily, you'll see them in also changing temporally. So, for example, this satellite image representing or showing your chlorophyll, again, concentrations. This is in winter, and you'll note that it's mostly blue. Very few reds, which indicate your high chlorophyll and high, potentially high primary production. Come spring, when it's warmer, then you suddenly have this explosion of red in the ocean, and that's what you call your spring bloom. Of course, this also comes with more light, apart from the temperature, so they're correlated in this case. And then, of course, grazing. Though someone eats those primary producers, and there are many herbivores in the ocean. The main herbivore for your phytoplankton, for example, are your zooplankton, such as this copepod, your tiny shrimp, or your phaucids, for example, your pteropods, so different crustaceans and mollusks, tiny types. And in this video, you'll actually see that this copepod is creating a feeding current by batting its legs. And it's creating this current, and that helps to stream water through its legs and mouth parts, which it then uses to filter out its food from the water column. And then you have grazers in different other ecosystems, such as your benthic ecosystem, where you have your algae or macroalgae, and the ones that eat them is, for example, this fish that's called a parrotfish. Can you guess why it's called a parrotfish? Yes, because its mouth and its teeth actually look like a parrot, where the teeth are fused, and they use that in order to scrape the algae on the surface of the rock or other types of substrate. Another type of organism that's important in grazing macroalgae are your sea urchin, as you can see here, where they tend to gather in certain numbers in parts of the reef. So the last factor that influences primary production is hydrodynamics. This is primarily indirect because this factor helps to bring nutrients up into the surface of the water column where there's enough light for photosynthesis. So this is mediated mainly by your wind blowing on the surface of the ocean. So the graph here represents two different seasons: your winter profile of the water column and your summer profile of the water column. So during winter, there's typically strong winds, and the water mass is greatly mixed. The dots represent your nutrient concentrations, and as you can see in the figure, you have your nutrients that are mixed all throughout the water column and not just at the bottom. So there's a source of your nutrients at the surface during winter. Unfortunately, during winter, there's no light, and it's also cold waters. So it's difficult for your primary producers to photosynthesize even if there's enough nutrients. However, as this transitions towards your spring and summer, then your water column becomes what is called stratified. There are layers of water masses where you have at the upper part, your upper water mass is warmer, it's less dense. However, at this point, there's less nutrients, and then now the nutrients are in the colder, denser waters at the bottom. But if there's enough wind, there's still some mixing that can go on, not just diffusion that's increasing in a small manner the nutrient concentration at the surface. Upwelling is a feature, hydrodynamic feature, that is very important for primary production, because when the wind blows in a certain direction and the water moves in a certain direction away from the wind, then this creates upwelling, wherein water from the bottom has to come up to replace the water from the surface that's moving away. And that water from the bottom is then nutrient rich, and that nutrient rich waters meet the area where there is enough light, and so that helps to increase your primary productivity. So hydrodynamics can be called a double-edged sword, because it's good in terms of mixing the nutrient-rich waters up into the light zone. However, note that your phytoplankton just float around on the water column, and they're also being mixed. So they wouldn't want to be mixed all the way down into the deeper areas where there's no light, even if there's high nutrients. So mixing cannot be too much. It has to be, in a way, just right, that it doesn't also cause too much turbulence for the plankton or cause it to be spending too much time at the bottom of the water column where there's not enough light anyway. So upwelling areas, they're quite important globally, because even though if upwelling areas account for only 1% of the ocean surface, they support 50% of the world's fisheries. So they're very key ecosystems in the oceans and for us humans, actually. I just want to show you a simulation showing you the changes in your primary production through time using the NASA satellites. So can you tell me what your observations were of the chlorophyll concentration from 2004 to 2014 in that the movie? Yeah, so you see the seasonality, especially at the temperate latitudes and the polar latitudes, in the large primary production at the polar areas during your spring and summertime. And then at the equatorial area, it's a little different, the dynamics of your primary production. Here in the Philippines, I'd like to just show a few of our results from our project, or actually previous project, on harmful algal blooms, and using satellite imagery through Dr. Villanoy and Dr. David's lab. You can see different months how the chlorophyll A changes, and you can see that during the amihan, or your northeast monsoon, that is the time when there's a lot of red all around the Philippines, and especially in the internal seas. So that's the time when there's relatively higher primary productivity in our country compared to when it's summer or during the southwest monsoon. So that was the first phase of primary production. The primary producers are very key in terms of the food web, and we rely on these primary producers to be able to provide the food at the higher trophic levels that we eat in our tables. However, there's the other side of primary production, and this is when I say when primary production goes awry, you have your harmful algal blooms. What are these? They are large accumulations or blooms of your algae. And when are they harmful? They're harmful when either one, they produce toxins that can prove fatal or cause illnesses for us and other animals, or it's the algal blooms are also harmful if they deplete oxygen in the water column, which potentially can lead to your fish kills. So here are images, some images from satellite, aerial images of large algal blooms, and they used to be called red tide, but I try to avoid that, and many people, particularly scientists, try to avoid that because it's a misnomer. Because harmful algal blooms don't have to be red to be harmful. So the correct term is harmful algal blooms, or HABs. This other image shows you a drop of water under a microscope. So during these algal blooms, that's when there's very dense numbers of these phytoplankton or other algae in a particular area. And these pictures show an algal bloom during or just before the Olympics, or the Water Olympics in Qingdao in China, and it covered the whole bay, and this was caused presumably by a green algae, actually a macroalgae, not a microalgae. Here in the Philippines, one of the stars for harmful algal blooms is the species called Pyrodinium bahamense variation compressum, or PBC for short. It has quite a complex life history. It has both a motile, meaning it's able to swim or weakly swim or float in the water column, and the cyst form, or you can think of the cyst as the seed. So this picture shows you the cyst form that's buried in the sediment, and then you have that motile form that can form chains, especially when it's blooming. So the problem with PBC is that it produces saxitoxin, and PBC is filtered out of the water by your shellfish, such as tahong or oysters, and then those shellfish are harvested by, guess who? Yep, us. And those shellfish can accumulate the saxitoxin to the point where if we eat them, then it becomes toxic and for us humans. So what are the signs? If you've eaten some form of shellfish, and after around 20-30 minutes or an hour or so, you start feeling numbness, especially in your mouth area, in your fingers area, and tingling and nausea, then you might want to go to the hospital and have yourself checked, possibly for what's called paralytic shellfish poisoning. Here's a map that shows the different areas in the Philippines that have experienced blooms by Pyrodinium. And as you can see, there's been a lot. It actually started in Maqueda Bay in 1983 and has now spread through many waters and embayments in particular in the Philippines. And if you look at a map globally for paralytic shellfish poisoning, in the 1970s there were only a few cases for paralytic shellfish poisoning. However, by 2006, it can be found pretty much all over the world. And according to Dr. Don Anderson from the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institute at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, he says that many countries are faced with a bewildering array of toxic or harmful species and impacts, as well as disturbing trends of increasing bloom incidence, larger areas affected, more fisheries resources impacted, and higher economic losses. So what are the potential causes of this spread in terms of harmful algal blooms? One is pollution. There's increased nutrients, so they can grow and reproduce more. The other is transport of species or HAB species to other areas through ship ballast water. So ships need water to regulate their buoyancy in the water column, and that water is taken up or released in different areas. So that water has phytoplankton or hab species that potentially can be transported to other areas where the ship is going. Other potential causes that are implicated for habs, or the spread of habs, are climatic shifts. So with warming waters or shifting weather patterns or climate patterns, then that can eventually promote growth of certain species in certain areas or more areas. And then there's also the fact that you can't discount that there are more people aware of habs, so you have increased observers that are reporting cases for habs in different areas. But more and more, those other causes in terms of human activity, pollution, and transport, and possibly climatic shifts, I think are really large culprits in this increasing hab occurrences globally. So, if you ever want to know if you can eat shellfish safely in particular areas of the Philippines, then you can refer to the website of the Bureau of Fisheries and Aquatic Resources, or BIFAR, and look at their shellfish bulletin. They issue this about every other week, and they tell you which areas you shouldn't, where shellfish should not be harvested, sold, bought, or eaten. So in this, for example, this bulletin that was issued in July 9, 2013, there are a lot of areas, particularly in the Samar area, that was experiencing your shellfish bans and your harmful algal blooms. So I'm showing this in particular because some of these areas, it was their first time to experience harmful algal blooms. So even here in the Philippines, they're still spreading new occurrences for your harmful algal blooms. So this is a more recent one, September 11, 2014, and by this point, there's only one area that has a shellfish ban posted in Masbate. So again, you can refer to this if you're interested in knowing if your shellfish is safe. So that's the one type of harmful algal bloom, your toxin-producing algae. The other type of harmful algal bloom are your fish gill blooms. So, for example, here is a series of news about fish gills in Pangasinan, particularly Bolinao and Anda. And this was in 2002. Fish gill hits coastal town of Pangasinan, and it was said that there was about 4 million pesos lost in terms of bangus for one operator, while another operator lost about 1 million more. So there's a lot of livelihood lost here. Unfortunately, in 2007, another fish gill occurred. This headline shows fish gill in Anda, Bolinao, curse of nature. And it doesn't end there. In 2010, another news headline saying that 50 million pesos worth of bangus was lost in a fish gill in the same area. And then in 2011, another fish gill strikes Anda, Bolinao in Pangasinan. So what happens in these fish gills? There's two modes. One is that because of too warm temperatures, the oxygen that's in the water becomes too low, and there's not enough for the fish that need this oxygen. So they die. Then the other mode for fish gills, which is through harmful algae, is that conditions become good for algal blooms, and then the algae don't live forever. They eventually die. And so what happens when they die? Yes, they decompose. and that decomposition process needs oxygen. So that process takes up your oxygen in the water, which again the fish need. And so the oxygen in the water is too low and the fish die, and that leads to all these fish kills. So there are many factors as well involved with fish kills, in terms of if there's too many fish or too much feeds that also decompose and take up the oxygen, or too many cages. So these are some things that can actually be addressed to avoid the occurrence of fish kills in aquaculture areas. So finally, we go back to a larger picture of your primary producers. I talked about the role in their food web, and then eventually some of the issues that are related to some of your primary producers. But on a larger scale, they're involved in the carbon cycle because they utilize your carbon dioxide. So they're part of what's called the biological pump in the carbon cycle, where they can be their sink of your carbon dioxide, and that goes into the food web, and some of the that carbon can eventually sink to the seafloor and not be released to the atmosphere. So obviously, since the carbon cycle plays an important role in climate change, then your primary producers and your phytoplankton and your bacteria and your mangrove plants and your seagrass play a critical role for serving as your sink of your carbon dioxide, and in relation to the rates for climate change. So there's a lot of study that's going now to try to understand more what their role is in terms of climate change. However, some have actually looked into this and thought of engineering a way to maybe boost fish stocks, or actually fertilize the sea to reduce carbon in the atmosphere. So there's that fertilization of the ocean to soak up your carbon dioxide in the atmosphere as your algae grow in the ocean. And then there's some proposals to fertilize your ocean, not only because of your carbon sink processes, but also possibly to boost fish stocks. For example, this Australian group that was proposing this in the Sulu Sea in 2007. So I leave you with that. I leave you with this thought or question, where what if you were part of an advisory group that was asked to allow or not allow these groups to fertilize our neighboring Sulu Sea to possibly boost our fish stocks, or also help the decrease carbon dioxide supposedly from the atmosphere, or that's what they claim. Will you allow them or not, or will you ask them more questions and in terms of the processes of their fertilization? So think about that and let me know your answer when we meet next time.